Good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Igor Istomin. I'm teaching here at the Department of Applied International Political Analysis. And on behalf of our university, I want to greet Professor John Mearsheimer from Chicago University. He is already given today the second of his lectures. And I have to say that the first lecture attracted great attention and great interest. And I think that Professor Mearsheimer doesn't need any further introduction, especially in this audience. He is one of, and he is actually the author of the, founder of the offensive realism, one of the brightest and most authoritative minds on international relations theory, on strategic analysis, on US strategy, and also today we have a very interesting topic that Professor Mearsheimer proposed to give, is the topic of the situation in the Middle East, the US strategy on the Middle East, and maybe also he will be able to expand on the Russian role in the Middle East. Thank you so much for being here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Igor. Thanks again for everybody showing up today to listen to me talk. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to your questions. What I'm going to speak about today is the current situation in the Middle East. And start off by giving you what I think is the big picture. The first point I would make is that deadly conflict and political instability are rampant in the region today. The amount of death and destruction in the Middle East over the past few years is quite remarkable. The situation in the Middle East is fundamentally different than it is in any other place on the planet at this point in time. Second point is that the deep causes of this situation are twofold. To put it in slightly different terms, the deep causes are, number one, local conditions that are particular to each country in that region. And secondly, U.S. foreign policy in the region since the Cold War ended in 1989, and especially since 2001, the year of 9/11. So I think the Americans have played a key role in causing problems in the region, but they're not the only source of the trouble. And my third point is that events in Syria notwithstanding, Russian influence in the Middle East is not very significant. The Russians are a minor player in the Middle East. It's basically the Americans that have been driving the train. Now, what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East since 9/11 or since 2001. And it's not surprising that I'm going to focus on the United States because, as I told you, the United States is the principal player in the region. If you want to know why there's so much death and destruction, so much murder and mayhem in the region, it's very important to understand what the Americans have been up to, because they are the key outside force in the region. But again, I want to emphasize it's not just the Americans, it's local conditions that matter. Countries in that region have agency. Now, my basic argument is that U.S. Middle East policy since 2011 has been marked by one failure after another and has played a key role in causing the trouble. Sometimes when I give this talk in the United States, I label the talk U.S. Middle East policy, one disaster after another. So the point I want to make to you, and this will become clear as we go along here, is that U.S. foreign policy has failed at almost every turn. Now, what we have to start is by talking about how the United States thinks about the Middle East. It's very important for you to understand the big picture. And the way you want to start thinking about U.S. Middle East policy is by asking a very simple question. What areas of the world are strategically important to the United States? Now, the most important area to the world, to the United States, is the Western Hemisphere, because that's our backyard. And for any great power, your backyard is what matters more than anything else. So we care greatly about the Western Hemisphere. The United States goes to great lengths to make sure that there's no other great power in the Western Hemisphere, number one. And number two, that no distant great powers, no great powers in Europe or no great powers in Asia, wander into the Western Hemisphere. That's our backyard. That's the most important area of the world for us. But the fact is, the United States is remarkably secure in the Western Hemisphere. And it doesn't have to worry much about the Western Hemisphere. So then the question becomes, what areas of the world are so important to the United States that we're willing to fight and die there in a really serious way? And the answer is that there are three areas outside of the United States that matter greatly for our security. And those three areas are Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Those are the three key areas of the world for us. And Europe and Northeast Asia are of great importance to us because that's where the other great powers are. Europe is where Imperial Germany was, it's where Napoleonic France was, it's where the Soviet Union was, it's where Nazi Germany was. Europe really matters to the United States because other great powers are there. The other region that is a home for great powers is obviously Asia, Northeast Asia. And there you have the Russians or Soviets again, because the Soviet Union, now Russia, is a country that spans both Europe and Asia, but also you have Japan, and now you have China. So Northeast Asia matters greatly. We pay serious attention to what's going on there. And if you think about World War II, the United States fought in two theaters in World War II, the European theater and the Asian theater. We fought against Imperial Japan in Asia, and we fought against Nazi Germany in Europe, two great powers that we viewed as a threat. We were deeply concerned that one of those countries might end up dominating either Europe or Asia. So those two areas matter for that reason. Third area of the world that we care greatly about is the Persian Gulf. Notice I'm not saying the Middle East, I'm saying the Persian Gulf. We care about the Persian Gulf because there is oil there. There's no great power in the Persian Gulf, there's no great power in the Middle East, but there's oil there. And oil is the one critical resource that we are willing to fight and die over. We do not want a situation where any great power controls all of that oil, or any local power, be it Iran or Iraq, controls all that oil. Very important that that not happen. So those are three areas we have historically cared greatly about. The areas that really don't matter much to the United States strategically are areas like Africa. Africa is an area that is of little strategic interest to the United States. People will sometimes say to me these days, you know, the Chinese are deeply involved in Africa. Isn't the United States worried about that? No, we're not. Why? Because Africa is of little strategic importance. Southeast Asia, really good example. During the Vietnam War, many realists argued that Southeast Asia was of little strategic importance, and therefore it made no sense to fight in Vietnam. No sense to fight in Vietnam. Virtually every realist in the United States opposed the Vietnam War because it was of no strategic importance. Vietnam was of no strategic importance to us. And they would say when the war ended and we lost the war, it didn't matter. 14 years later, we won the Cold War. Who cares whether we lost in Vietnam? Didn't matter. There are no great powers in Southeast Asia. That was our argument. No great powers in Southeast Asia, and no strategic resources that mandated us to be there. And of course, Southwest Asia, India, Pakistan, Northwest Asia, sometimes called Central Asia, and the rest of the Middle East are of little strategic importance to the United States. Syria, Egypt, and Israel are three countries that matter little to the United States for strategic reasons. They are not core strategic interests. What happens in Syria matters little to us. What happens in Egypt or in Israel matters little to us. These are countries that are not great powers and they don't have oil. So the idea that you're going to fight and die for them for strategic reasons? No. Okay, the areas that matter are Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf, historically. Now, very importantly, America's core strategic interest from 1900, when we finally established hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, up until 2000, Europe is the most important area of the world for the United States. Northeast Asia is the second most important area of the world, and the third most important area of the world is the Persian Gulf. The United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor by Japan. Nevertheless, before we went to war in Europe and after we went to war in Europe, our policy was a Europe-first policy. During the Cold War, when we used to run war games, what would happen is we'd get a war going on the Central Front in Europe, and then what we would do is we would swing forces out of Asia into Europe to fight against the Soviets. Why? Because Europe was more important than Northeast Asia was. Our allies in Asia were always deeply bothered by that. They thought that the main reason that we were swinging forces from Asia to Europe was because most Americans could trace their heritage to Europe, and therefore we had a bias in favor of Europe and against Asia. That was not true at all. We were deeply concerned about Europe at the expense of Northeast Asia because Europe was strategically the most important area of the world for us. It always has been. Northeast Asia was second and the Gulf was third. The United States is about to undergo a fundamental transformation. Asia, East Asia in particular, is going to become the most important area of the world for us. Persian Gulf is going to become the second most important area of the world for us, and Europe is going to be a distant third. This is a transformation that is taking place that most people in the United States and most people abroad have not fully grasped. You want to fully grasp this, because this is going to be of tremendous importance for the rest of your life. The United States is shifting its gun sights from Europe to Asia in a really big way. And this is really all about the rise of China. I want to make one important qualification in my overall argument so far. You remember I said, when I talked about the areas of the world that are important to the United States, second is Northeast Asia. And you remember I said back here that Southeast Asia was of little importance to the United States. I'm telling you that East Asia is of great importance to the United States. That means Southeast Asia. Why is this the case? It's because China is a great power now. And China is physically located in both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. Many of you have been reading about the potential conflict in the South China Sea between the United States and China. The fact that China is adjacent to the South China Sea and claims the South China Sea tells you that the United States is not just concerned about Northeast Asia now and in the future. It will be concerned with Southeast Asia as well. So what we're talking about is East Asia, the Gulf, and Europe. I want to say a few words about the Gulf and about Europe. The Gulf is terribly important to the United States because it is and is going to be important to China. You understand that China imports a huge amount of its oil, and indeed today roughly 25% of Chinese oil comes from the Gulf. And almost all predictions regarding future Chinese dependence on oil says that number will go up to 20, 25, 30%. So the Chinese care greatly about the Persian Gulf. And because the Chinese care greatly about the Persian Gulf, and by the way, the Indians care greatly about the Persian Gulf, where they also get lots of oil, you can rest assured that Uncle Sam will care greatly about the Persian Gulf. So what I'm telling you here is that when you think about American grand strategy, it's important to understand that Northeast Asia, or East Asia as I now describe it, and the Persian Gulf are linked in very important ways because the Chinese economy is so heavily dependent on imported oil from the Gulf. And Europe will be a distant third. And the reason that Europe will be a distant third is that there is no great power in Europe today, be it Germany or Russia, that threatens to dominate the entire region. So when you hear people talk about the swing strategy, they're talking about swinging forces to East Asia. But the question you want to ask yourself is, where are they swinging forces from? Those forces will be swung from Europe over time to Asia as China continues to rise, because we have no good strategic reason to maintain large-scale forces in Europe, the Ukraine crisis notwithstanding. So that's the basic grand strategic picture. And again, you want to remember, when I'm talking about the Persian Gulf, I'm not talking about the overall Middle East, although the United States has been involved in the overall Middle East. Now, let's switch gears and talk about U.S. strategies in the Persian Gulf. I just talked about all the different regions of the world, but you want to talk about how the United States has dealt with the Persian Gulf and the Middle East more generally over time. You want to understand what we're up to in that area. Now, 1945 to 1968, the United States cared greatly about the Gulf, in large part because the Soviet Union was adjacent to the Gulf. What's amazing about the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and most of you are all too young or too young to appreciate this, is the Soviet Union was a country that was physically located in Europe, the #1 area of the world for the United States outside of the Western Hemisphere from a strategic perspective. It was physically located in Northeast Asia, the second most important area of the world for the United States, and it was adjacent to Iran. After the 1979 revolution in Iran, and I'll talk more about this in a second, we worried greatly about the Soviets invading Iran. So the three areas of the world that we cared the most about, we had the Soviets either physically there or right next door. So going back to 1945, we were worried about the Gulf and we were worried about the Soviets. The question is, how did we deal with the problem? From 45 to 68, we depended on the British. The Americans had no military forces of any significance in the region, nor did we build military forces to fight and die in the region. It was an area of great strategic importance, you understand that? But in a very important way, we passed the buck. We relied on the British, who had a rich history in the region, as you all know, to do the heavy lifting for us. In 1968, the British said they were too tired and too weak to continue policing the Gulf and to continue policing other areas east of Suez, and they were pulling back. So we were in a quandary as to what to do. What we did from 1968 to 1979 is we relied heavily on the Shah. We relied heavily on Iran and to a lesser extent on Saudi Arabia to keep peace and order in the Persian Gulf. Remember, we put the Shah back in power in 1953. 1953, put the Shah back in power. And we put back in power for a good reason. We wanted a friendly leader in Iran so that if a rainy day came along, we could rely on the Shah. And that's what happened in 1968, after the British reduced their influence. From 1968 to 1979, we relied on Iran. In 1979, there was the revolution in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. U.S.-Iranian relations went down the toilet bowl, and the United States, for the first time, had to develop its own military forces to fight in the Gulf. And we developed the famous Rapid Deployment Force, the RDF. It was an offshore capability. It was an over-the-horizon capability. It was a military force that was stationed outside of the region and designed to be able to move quickly into the region if need be. We were an offshore balancer from 1979 to 1991. Even though we had this powerful military force that could be used in the region, we went to great lengths not to keep it in the region. Then, in 1991, on August 2nd, 1991, you all know what happened. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. George H.W. Bush was the president. He said that was unacceptable, and we decided to go to war against Saddam Hussein to throw him, or to throw his military, out of Kuwait. We did that, of course, in January, February 1991. Saddam, again, invaded Kuwait August 2nd, 1990, and then we fought the war, first Gulf War, January, February 1991. The first elements that went into Saudi Arabia to fight that war were the RDF forces. And then we brought other forces from Germany in as well, and we won a great victory. We threw Saddam's forces out of Kuwait, and Kuwait regained its independence, and Iraq indeed suffered a humiliating defeat. Then, under the Clinton administration, we made a fatal mistake. Instead of winning the war and then moving back offshore, we decided to stay in the region physically. We decided to stay there. And we decided that instead of letting Iran and Iraq check each other, we would take it upon ourselves to check both countries. It was called dual containment. Let me explain to you what happened there. You all remember the Iraq-Iran War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. Iran versus Iraq. The United States actually assisted Iraq in that war. You've seen the famous pictures of Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein standing next to each other, smiling. What was going on there is that we were in the period 79 to 91, that's when the 80 to 88 war took place, offshore balancing. We were playing the local powers off against each other. We were letting Iran and Iraq check each other, which is exactly what we should have done. We abandoned that policy in the first year of the Clinton administration, and we decided instead that we would keep forces in the region, no more over-the-horizon capability, and that we would check both Iran and Iraq ourselves. That's dual containment. Now, what happens here is we get more and more involved. We've got forces in Saudi Arabia, and this is one of the principal motivating factors behind Osama bin Laden's attack on the United States on September 11th. Osama bin Laden was greatly bothered by the fact that the American military was physically located in Saudi Arabia. Right? So what happens in 2001 is the United States gets whacked. And what does the United States decide to do as a consequence? George W. Bush is now the president. We decide to abandon dual containment and adopt an offensively oriented policy of regime change. And that, of course, is what I'm going to talk about today, because I'm going to talk about U.S. Middle East policy from 2001 forward. I'm going to get to that in a second. The policy from 2001 forward is regime change. But what I've done here, what I've tried to do, is I want to walk you through the evolution of U.S. policy towards the Gulf since 1945, because it's important that you understand the context. You understand where regime change came from. The story that I'm telling you here about American Middle East policy from 45 forward is that from 45 to 79, the United States basically relied on others to do the heavy lifting in the Gulf. We did not have the military capability to do much of anything in the Gulf from 45 to 79. We relied first on the British, then mainly on the Iranians, and lesser on the Saudis. Then, when it became clear that we were going to have to build military forces to deal with the region, we developed an over-the-horizon capability. We acted as an offshore balancer. We did not go onshore because we understood we'd get into trouble if we did. Okay? That all ended in 91. Actually, in 92. That all ended. And what happened is we moved to dual containment. But it's containment, which is much more defensive in nature than regime change, which is offensive in nature. Then comes September 11th. We adopt regime change under George W. Bush, which is continued under President Obama. All right. Let's talk about regime change. And the basic argument I'm going to make here, as it'll become clear as we go along, is there's really no difference, no meaningful difference between George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Their foreign policies in the region are very similar. What we want to do is we want to talk about the targets for regime change, and then we want to talk about the record, America's record, how well we've done the job. All right, 5 big targets: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Egypt. All 5 of these abject failures. Let me lay out the story. Afghanistan, September 11th, 2001, the United States is attacked by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is physically located at the time in Afghanistan. So the United States, in mid-October 2001, goes to war against Afghanistan. In particular, we go to war against the Taliban. We topple the Taliban relatively quickly. By late November, early December 2011, the Taliban is toppled, and we have put in place a new government under Karzai. And, things ultimately don't work out very well. The United States today is still at war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the longest war in American history. Just think about that. Afghanistan is the longest war in American history. Barack Obama said that when he left the presidency, all of the troops would be out of Afghanistan. All the troops will not be out of Afghanistan. My guess is that they'll leave about 10,000 American troops in Afghanistan when he leaves office this coming January. The United States has spent roughly $113 billion in Afghanistan. which is more money when you control for inflation than the United States spent on the Marshall Plan in Western Europe in the early stages of the Cold War. Think about that. We have spent more money on Afghanistan than we spent in the Marshall Plan in the late 1940s. And what do we have to show for it? I told you, first of all, the war is ongoing. Second of all, the Taliban has come back from the dead. We did not decisively defeat the Taliban. It was a temporary defeat. The Taliban has come back from the dead. You understand the Taliban, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, now controls roughly 1/3 of Afghanistan. Do you believe that? Taliban controls roughly 1/3 of Afghanistan. And the reason we're keeping troops there is that if we take those American troops out, the Taliban will end up controlling even more of Afghanistan. And by the way, they're going to end up controlling more of Afghanistan anyway. And furthermore, you know who else is in Afghanistan these days? ISIS. ISIS is becoming a meaningful force in Afghanistan. This is disastrous for the United States. We have basically lost the war. We're just unwilling to admit it. And we're trying to kick the can down the road. That's effectively what Obama's doing. He doesn't want to be the one that they can point to and say, he lost the war in Afghanistan. So he's going to keep a small number of troops there so that Hillary Clinton will be blamed for losing Afghanistan. But we're going to lose. After having spent an enormous sum of money and fought this war for a longer period than any other war in American history. Then there's Iraq. We did a great job in Iraq, right? The country's basically broken up into 3 parts now. That was certainly not our intention. And oh, by the way, what did we get as a result of the war in Iraq? ISIS. You understand, there was no terrorism when Saddam Hussein was in trouble. Terrorists knew what would happen to them if they were operating in Iraq, right? The Iron Fist had come down on them. So there's no problem with terrorists. We broke the country up into effectively 3 parts. And we ended up with ISIS. I would estimate, very hard to get good numbers, but I would estimate that at least 500,000 Iraqis died as a result of the American campaign in Iraq. So not only do you have a country that's broken, 500,000 Iraqis are dead. By the way, just talking about Iraq and Afghanistan, estimates are that it will ultimately cost the United States somewhere between $4 to $6 trillion for those 2 wars. Almost 7,000 Americans dead, many, many more Americans badly wounded as a result. And what's the end result? We lost both wars. Then there's Syria, which is probably the biggest mess of all. The United States, of course, played a key role there. We did not invade Syria, but we have been deeply involved in trying to bring Assad down since 2005. The Bush administration had its gun sights on Syria for a long time. I believe that we helped precipitate the revolution against Assad in 2011. And we have been funding the jihadis. We sometimes refer to them as moderate forces arrayed against Assad. But we've been trying to bring the regime down from the beginning. You know, the regime first got into serious trouble in March 2011. That's when the Arab Spring was beginning to pick up speed. And Barack Obama said in August 2011 that Assad had to go. And then in early 2005, we began to move to commit money and resources to helping make that a reality. So we've been working hard to bring Assad down. We've been fueling that civil war. What's the end result? The end result is that probably about 400,000 Syrians have died in a country of 23 million people. 11 million people have been forced to leave their homes. Of those 11 million, 4 million have left the country. Some are in Turkey, some are in Jordan, and many are in Europe. The refugee crisis in Europe is in large part, not exclusively, but in large part, a function of this conflict. And 7 million people are internally displaced. So think about this. You have a country of 23 million people, roughly 400,000 people are dead, 7 million people are internally displaced, 4 million people have left the country. The amount of death and destruction is mind-boggling. You've seen what's happening in Aleppo, and there's no end in sight. And you want to understand that the United States was interested from the beginning in regime change here. Then there's Libya, where the United States and its Western allies played a key role in helping to bring down Colonel Gaddafi. And Colonel Gaddafi, of course, was eventually killed. What's the end result? Chaos in Libya. I just want to back up a second here. You understand what the American goal was. The American goal was regime change. The American goal was to get rid of leaders like Saddam, leaders like Colonel Gaddafi, and replace them with democratically elected governments on the assumption that you would then have a stable and prosperous political system in place. We were not just bringing down regimes with the thought in mind that we were going to sow chaos and disorder. That's what's happened, of course. This is my basic point here, that the United States has failed at almost every turn. We thought we were going to do good. I want to be very clear here. People like George W. Bush were not trying to wreck these countries on purpose. They inadvertently ended up wrecking these countries because regime change was a harebrained scheme. That's the basic point. We have failed at almost every turn. And by the way, for those of you who talk about international law, the United States is very big at pointing the finger at other countries and saying, you violated international law. What we did in Libya, what we're doing in Syria, is a violation of international law. We're violating the sovereignty of these countries. We have no UN resolution that gave us permission to do regime change in Libya or gives us permission to do regime change in Syria. The United States just decided it had the right and the responsibility and the ability to get rid of Assad. We're very big into social engineering. That's what regime change is all about. And of course, the end result in Libya is that it is a country that is now housing large numbers of terrorists and causing all sorts of problems for the United States and the Europeans with regard to dealing with the terrorism problem. So if you look at what happened in Libya, you look at what happened in Syria, you look at what happened in Iraq, you look at what happened in Afghanistan, it's really quite amazing at the extent to which the United States failed to achieve its basic goals. Finally, there's Egypt. And here the story is somewhat different, although the basic end result is not that different. The United States was interested in promoting democracy in all of these countries, and that includes Egypt. And when Hosni Mubarak, who was a dictator, was removed from power in Egypt, and the United States helped give him a gentle push out of office, there was great hope that democracy would actually be put in place in Egypt. There was an election, actually, in Egypt in June 2012, and the problem was, from the American perspective, the Muslim Brotherhood won. So you got regime change, and you got a democratically elected leader, but he was from the Muslim Brotherhood. And this was not good from an American perspective. But nevertheless, the Americans, much to their credit, did nothing about it. The leader remained in place, Morsi, for about 1 year. And what happened was all sorts of dissent began to emerge in Egypt. And there was a movement to topple Morsi, to have a coup against Morsi, because most people in the Egyptian establishment were unhappy with a Muslim Brotherhood leader running the country. So what happened was there was a coup in July of 2013. Now remember what happened here. Mubarak is overthrown in early 2011, then you have an election in June of 2012, right? And Morsi, the leader, Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood leader, takes office. And then a year later, in July 2013, you have a coup. The United States went along with the coup. The United States was not the principal cause of the coup. And I've tried to go to great lengths here to say that the United States is not the only force at play in the region. And that's certainly the case with Egypt. But you had a coup in July 2013, and Morsi was removed from power. And who took his place? A general, a thug, a dictator. So no democracy in Egypt. And by the way, he then went out and took vengeance against the Muslim Brotherhood. And roughly 1,400 members of the Muslim Brotherhood were murdered in the wake of the coup. And you ended up with a non-democratic leader. End result, another example of failure. So basically, you had 5 big operations that were all designed to produce regime change, which would lead to a democratic and prosperous political order in each of those 5 countries. And what's the end result? 0 for 5. Let me come at this from a slightly different perspective. What's the end result? First of all, you've made the terrorism problem worse. There was no ISIS before we went into Iraq. You now have ISIS. As I said to you before, look at what's happened in Afghanistan. Not only is the Taliban back and controlling 30% of the country, you've got ISIS in Afghanistan. Look at Libya. It's terrorism central. You go to Europe and you talk to Europeans about controlling the terrorism problem. They're mortified by what's happened in Libya. Of course, they helped create the situation as much as the Americans did in that case. Inflicted massive suffering on innocent civilians. Most Americans, most Europeans, most Russians don't think much about this because we're physically removed from the situation. But if you think about what's happened here, just remember those numbers that I gave you for Syria. 23 million people, 11 million people displaced from their homes. 11 million, 7 million internally displaced, 4 million abroad. 400,000 dead. Probably a bit more, if not a lot more, in Syria. Huge numbers of people dead, their lives destroyed. Estimates are that 4 out of every 5 people in Syria live in poverty. Oh, just horrible. Third, all of this helped exacerbate the Shia-Sunni divide. All of you follow the situation in Syria, you can see that divide very clearly. You have the Iranians, you have Hezbollah, and you have the Assad government. Basically all Shia on one side, you have the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Turks on the other side, all basically Sunnis. This divide was not a meaningful divide in terms of conflict before 2001. Every year it gets worse and worse. And then finally, as a result of all these crises, especially the Syrian and Libyan crisis, you're flooding Europe with refugees, which is causing huge problems for the European Union. When I go to Europe, I often say to my European friends, you know, this whole crisis that you're facing is mainly compliments of Uncle Sam. If Uncle Sam hadn't gone into the Middle East with his policy of regime change and caused all this death and destruction, you wouldn't have all these refugees flowing in at the rate they're now coming. 3 missing pieces of the story that I want to talk about. 1 is Israel, 2 is Iran, and 3 is ISIS. Because I've focused mainly on regime change, but U.S. Middle East policy matters greatly with regard to Israel, Iran, They were talking mainly about the nuclear deal and with regard to ISIS. So let me just say a few words about each of these matters. The United States and Israel. The United States was deeply committed under Barack Obama, and it was committed under George W. Bush to creating a two-state solution. Right? We wanted to make sure that the Palestinians got a state of their own. Bill Clinton, by the way, was deeply committed to this goal as well. And end result is we failed. We failed. There's going to be no two-state solution. What we're going to get is a greater Israel. A greater Israel means that Israel is going to end up owning and controlling those areas known as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem that were supposed to comprise a Palestinian state. There's going to be no two-state solution. Obama worked overtime to get a two-state solution. He went head-to-head with Prime Minister Netanyahu on a number of occasions. Netanyahu beat him at every turn. Could be no two-state solution. We failed. The United States does not want a greater Israel. Why is that the case? Because our terrorism problem is linked to Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. It's just very important to understand that. It is not the only cause of our terrorism problem. You want to remember, before I told you that when the United States left troops in Saudi Arabia after the first Gulf War, that enraged Osama bin Laden. That was a cause of our terrorism problem. This is also a major cause of our terrorism problem. And to illustrate that, look at what the 9/11 Commission said about this issue. The 9/11 Commission notes that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, he's the principal architect of the attacks. He's in Guantanamo now. KSM, who it calls the principal architect of the 9/11 attacks, was primarily motivated by the Palestinian issue. In the Commission's words, by his own account, KSM's animus towards the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. policy favoring Israel. Right? Very important to understand this. Right? The reason that Barack Obama and George W. Bush wanted to solve the Palestinian problem, wanted the Palestinians to have a state of their own and put this whole issue to bed, was in large part because it drives our terrorism problem. It's not the only driver, but it helps drive the terrorism problem. And my point to you is, we failed. Obama failed. Question is, where do we end up here? Well, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said in 2007, and all sorts of other Israeli leaders have said, that if you get a greater Israel, if you don't have a two-state solution and you get a greater Israel, what Israel will end up in is a South Africa-like struggle. This is just another way of saying Israel will end up as an apartheid state. Israel's going to end up looking like white-controlled South Africa. And the United States, as you know, is joined at the hip with Israel. And that's not good. So we failed to cause a two-state solution. Greater Israel is now a certainty. Furthermore, Barack Obama, and before that George W. Bush, failed to prevent the 3 Gaza wars, which caused the Palestinians massive suffering. And furthermore, even without the Gaza wars, the Palestinians live in a world of apartheid. And the end result is that all sorts of other peoples in the Middle East are deeply upset about this. And again, this helps fuel our terrorism problem. So with regard to Israel, another failure. United States and Iran. This is the one success, although I'm going to qualify that. Talk a little bit about Iran. First point, Iran is not a threat to dominate the Persian Gulf at this point in time. Some people talk about Iran as a potential hegemon, and they argue that the United States has to be deeply involved in the region just to keep the Iranians under control. Iran is not a very powerful military state. Its military is just not that formidable. And second, if their military ever does become formidable, the United States will not allow it to dominate the region. This past December, I was in the Persian Gulf at a conference where various leaders from the Gulf states were worrying themselves sick about the Iranian threat. And they think that Iran is very powerful, it's on the march, and that their survival is threatened by Iran. I told them I didn't think that was the case at all. I didn't think Iran was that powerful. And I said, furthermore, even if Iran were powerful, the United States is simply not going to let Iran dominate the Gulf. So that's not the issue here. What the United States really cares about with regard to Iran is its nuclear program. Because as you know, the United States is deeply opposed to nuclear proliferation, as are the Russians. And in fact, Russia worked with the United States and the Chinese and the Germans and the French and the British to rein in the Iran nuclear program. My argument is that the Iran nuclear deal is a good thing. It's a good deal. There's no question about that. And I think this is the one instance where the Obama administration scored a success. It's the one instance where we were successful. But the key issue you want to ask yourself is what happens after 15 years? Now, my basic view on this issue is that for Iran not to want nuclear weapons after the deal runs out in about 15 years, it has to feel secure. You have to understand that the reason that countries want nuclear weapons is that they are the ultimate deterrent. If you have nuclear weapons, it's highly unlikely anyone will attack you. I've said on numerous occasions in public forums that if I were an Iranian national security advisor, I would advise the leadership to get nuclear weapons. Iran should have nuclear weapons. Russia has nuclear weapons. You don't see Russia moving to get rid of its nuclear weapons, do you? They like their nuclear weapons here, right? You come back to the United States, we have nuclear weapons. You don't see us getting rid of our nuclear weapons, do you? Israel, right? Israel doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but Israel doesn't want to get rid of its nuclear weapons. Why doesn't Israel want to get rid of its nuclear weapons? Because the Israelis understand they are the ultimate deterrent. Do you think if Iran had nuclear weapons, the United States and Israel would be threatening to attack Iran? You think so? I don't think so. When somebody has nuclear weapons, you are really very careful about how you deal with them, because they may use those nuclear weapons in retaliation, right? So here I am, I'm an Iranian national security advisor. The United States is threatening to attack me. Israel's threatening to attack me. Very simple solution. Just load the shotgun up with nuclear weapons and say, you screw around with me, you run the risk of being vaporized. That really focuses the mind. You can rest assured that the Americans and the Israelis will start to think very differently about dealing with Iran. Ehud Barak, former Israeli prime minister, said, the reason to think that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons is because it makes so much sense. Just think about what he's saying. He understands that from Iran's point of view, just as from Israel's point of view, just as from Russia's point of view, just as from America's point of view, it makes a lot of sense to have the ultimate deterrent, right? So the question then becomes, how, after this deal runs out, do we convince the Iranians not to go down the nuclear road, which, by the way, isn't Russia's interest and in America's interest? How do we do that? And the answer is, we have to have good, we meaning mainly the Americans, we have to have good relations with Iran. They have to think that we don't have the gun sights on them. We not only need the nuclear deal now, we need a rapprochement, a significant improvement in relations with Iran over time. We need that so that once the deal runs out, we don't have an Iran that's racing to get nuclear weapons. Now the question is, how likely is that to happen? Well, this is Donald Trump on the Iran deal. You've probably read what he had to say. He's not going to win next week or 2 weeks from now. He's not going to win. But nevertheless, there are a lot of people in the country, especially in the Republican Party, who think like he does. Just look at his views. And by the way, even if Hillary Clinton wins a decisive victory, the right is going to put tremendous pressure on her to be tough on Iran. Not that they'll have to, as will become clear in a second. But anyway, that's his views. If he's going to dismantle this agreement, it's going to give the Iranians very powerful incentives to get nukes. Here's Hillary Clinton on the Iran deal. I think we have achieved a great deal with the Iranian nuclear agreement. She was a big supporter of the deal, much to her credit. That has to be enforced absolutely, with consequences for Iran at the slightest deviation from their requirements under the agreement. So far, so fine. But here we go. I do not think we should promise or even look toward normalizing relations, because we have a lot of other business to get done with Iran. Come on, right? You know, you're going to take the stick and poke them in the eye. This is great, right? This is really guaranteed to ensure that they don't want nuclear weapons. We're going to show them how tough we are. I don't think that's the way it's going to work. Don't think so. And by the way, the next time you try to put together a coalition that includes the Russians and the Chinese to crack down on the Iranians, you're going to find, Uncle Sam, that it's much more difficult to get the Russians and the Chinese to cooperate with you. Because relations between the United States and Russia and the United States and China are significantly worse today than they were when they first put the coalition together to crack down on Iran. So what I'm telling you here, folks, is I think that the Obama administration deserves kudos. They deserve praise on one issue, which is Iran. But when you start to think about what is going to happen over the long term, it looks like even that one's going to unravel. Then we come to ISIS. Remember, I was dealing with 3 additional issues: Israel, Iran, and ISIS. Our strategy for dealing with ISIS is part of a larger strategy that calls for toppling Assad and defeating ISIS at the same time. It's just very important to understand that our thinking about ISIS is inextricably bound up with our thinking about Assad. And we want not just to defeat ISIS, we want to topple Assad. The United States is deeply committed to getting rid of Assad. Remember, that was the point I made to you when I was describing our policy towards Syria. I told you the George W. Bush administration, starting in the mid-2000s, the early 2000s, was bent on getting rid of Assad. Second point you want to keep in mind is we call for defeating ISIS with Western air power and local boots on the ground. Although we now have some American boots on the ground. Okay. 3 problems with the strategy. 3 problems. Problem number 1, you can't topple Assad and you'll end up in a proxy war with Russia if you continue to target Assad. And the U.S. needs the Russian and the Iranians to help defeat ISIS. From an American perspective, once the Russians came into Syria, it's game over in terms of toppling Assad. The Russians are committed to keeping Assad in power. The Iranians are committed to keeping Assad in power, and Hezbollah is committed to keeping Assad in power. And there's no way we can topple Assad. And if we continue to try to topple Assad, right, it's going to make it almost impossible to defeat ISIS. Because we need the Russians and we need the Syrian government we need Assad. We need the Russians, we need Assad, we need the Iranians, we need Hezbollah to help us defeat ISIS. It's just that simple. But the United States is just deeply committed, number one, to getting rid of Assad, and number two, because of the Ukraine crisis, and I'll talk more about this, the Americans can't bring themselves to cooperate with the Russians. So the end result is you're likely to get a proxy war here in Syria. And that's not going to do anything to help defeat ISIS. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is even if you defeat ISIS militarily, right, and you see that the United States and its allies are having quite a bit of success in Iraq, not in Syria, with regard to ISIS. Even if you defeat them, they're just going to melt away and come back to fight another day. You want to keep this in mind. And let me give you a very important analogy that you want to keep in your frontal lobes as you read about what's happening with regard to ISIS. We went into Afghanistan in October 2001, as I told you before. And we had defeated the Taliban by late November, early December 2001. You remember that story? What you have to remember is that we did not decisively defeat the Taliban. That what happened was they melted away into Afghanistan, into the countryside. They returned to their homes. And then they came back to fight another day. Remember what I told you, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States just told us that 30% of Afghanistan is now controlled by the Taliban. They came back from the dead. So the point that I'm making to you here, we are not going to decisively defeat ISIS. This is not going to be like what happened to Nazi Germany in 1945. It'll be a limited defeat. They'll melt away and come back to fight another day. And the more general point is the ideology, the dissatisfaction, cannot be defeated with military power. There has to be some sort of political solution. Just let's focus on Iraq for a second. You understand that the reason that ISIS is so powerful in Iraq is because the Shia who run Iraq treat the Sunnis so badly. And it's those disaffected Sunnis who form the base of ISIS. And the United States, smartly, has been screaming at the leadership in Baghdad for years now, that leadership is Shia, to treat the Sunnis with great respect. Because the American leadership understands that the only way you can shut down this conflict is for the Shia to treat the Sunnis much better than they now do. But the Shia refuse to do that. So the end result here is those Sunnis are still going to be disaffected. And the end result is ISIS is still going to have a lot of sway, whether it renames itself or not. So the point that I'm making to you here is, even if you defeat it militarily, not going to buy you much. You need a political solution. Third problem, using military force against Muslims in the Arab and Islamic world only makes the terrorism problem worse. Right? All you have to do is read about why people in the Western world become terrorists and go to fight for ISIS, why people in the Arab and Islamic world support ISIS. It's very clear that a heavy-handed American policy that relies on air power and drones and so forth and so on, and winning big military victories is going to cause more trouble than do good. What's the balance sheet here? Remember where I started. Remember the story I told you. Remember I told you about the evolution of American policy in the Gulf over time and how we ended up at 2001 for the first time pursuing this remarkably ambitious policy of regime change. 5 targets, 5 failures. Israel, Iran, ISIS. Israel, Our principal goal under Barack Obama and under George W. Bush and under Bill Clinton was to create a two-state solution. We understood that the present situation was a disaster and that moving towards a greater Israel would be a disaster. Failure. Iran, the one case where you can point to success. But there, I said, I think over the long term, it's hard to see this working. I hope I'm wrong. And then finally, with regard to ISIS, the idea that we're going to defeat ISIS in any meaningful way and end this problem once and for all, I think is a pipe dream. There needs to be a political solution, mainly involving the Shia and the Sunni, and that's not going to happen. Let me say a few words about Syria, which is a subject I'm sure you care greatly about, because it is the one area, as I said at the beginning of my talk, where the Russians are involved. First, a few words about the implications of Russian involvement. As I said before, and I want to repeat myself here, once the Russians come into Syria in the fall of 2015, it's game over for the United States with regard to getting rid of Assad. The Americans find this very hard to accept, but it's true. It's just, the Russians are just not going to let us topple Assad, and they've got the Iranians and Hezbollah on their side. So we should think differently about this one. What's the best strategy for ending the war? I think it's obvious what the best strategy is. Is it a good strategy? No, not really, but it's the best strategy. And I think we should pursue it for humanitarian purposes in large part. Remember what I said to you before, from an American perspective, Syria is of little strategic interest to us. It matters, I believe, that we stop this war for humanitarian reasons. And the best strategy here is to prop up the Assad government. The best strategy is for the Americans to work with the Russians to prop up and strengthen the Assad government, and then work with the Assad government and the Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah to roll up ISIS in Syria and to roll up the jihadis and create a situation where the government in Damascus controls as much of the country as possible and puts out the fires that are consuming that country. This is not going to be a palatable solution for the United States for all sorts of reasons, but there's no alternative. We're not going to remove Assad from power, and we just have to accept the fact that the only way to shut this one down is to work with the other side. Is that going to happen? This brings me to my final point. I think it's not going to happen, and I think it's not going to happen because the Americans are incapable of working with the Russians in any meaningful way, and that's in large part because relations between the United States and Russia have deteriorated to the point where it is almost impossible for us to countenance cooperating with the Russians, especially for the purposes of strengthening the Assad regime. Just think about the situation that we face here, right? We're talking about working with the Russians, who we loathe because of the Ukraine crisis. This is all fallout from the Ukraine crisis, right? The United States cannot bring itself to work with the Russians, right? And the idea of working with the Russians to prop up the Assad government, which we've been deeply committed to getting rid of since the days of George W. Bush, makes it even tougher. So the end result is I don't think that the war in Syria is going to be shut down at any point in time. What does the future hold for the Middle East? I say with great sadness, and I mean this, more trouble. And I think that, as I said at the very beginning of my talk, a lot of this has to do with local conditions, for sure, but much of it also has to do with U.S. policy in the region. The United States has been a major force in the Middle East since September 11th. And in the process, it has done very little good and much harm. And sadly, there's no reason to think that anything is likely to change soon. Thank you. Sir.
Yes, Mr. Mearsheimer, thank you for this great opportunity.
Is your microphone working?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Mr. Mearsheimer, thank you for this great opportunity to listen to your lectures, and especially thank you for the way you present the topic. My name is Mikhtay Vazov, and I'm a master student. And my first question is, are there any ways of fixing the situation in the Middle East? The second question is there any chance that the United States will ever review its regime change policy and suspend it, or we're going to witness more areas of turmoil? And I don't want to sound like a fan of conspiracy theories, but still, are private military companies really influence the decision-making process concerning?
You were asking too many questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Because there's no way I can even remember all those
Okay.
questions. Tell me what your first question was.
Are there any ways of fixing the situation in the Middle East?
Well, just with regard to the first question, are there any ways of fixing the problem? I painted a very pessimistic picture of what has happened and where we're going. So I have hardly any good solutions at all. I told you what I think needs to be done on Syria. I told you I think it's not a very appealing strategy, but it's the least bad strategy. I told you with regard to Iran that what we have to do is take the threat away and have a rapprochement with Iran. So I can point to various places where I think the United States should do X and Y. But in terms of fixing the problem at a macro level, it's very hard to figure out what to do. Your second question, I think, is a very interesting question. That is, how does the United States think about regime change? Remember when I put the targets up there, I said Afghanistan was the first country in which we did regime change. Then Iraq was the second country in which we did regime change. And both of those regime changes took place under George W. Bush, okay, before 2008. Barack Obama gets elected in 2008, and you would think that Barack Obama, who ran as a peace candidate in 2008, would get out of the business of regime change. That's what you would think, right? However, who is responsible for Libya? George W. Bush? No, he's out of office. Barack Obama. Who is responsible for Syria? George W. Bush? No, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Who is responsible for Egypt? George W. Bush? No, he's out of office. Barack Obama. So this tells you something. And most people will say, let's talk about Hillary Clinton, who I think will be the successor to Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton is more hawkish. I think you can argue she's considerably more hawkish than Barack Obama. So just looking at Barack Obama and how he behaved compared to George W. Bush, you sort of get the sense that the United States is kind of hardwired to do regime change. It really likes regime change. And by the way, many high-level officials here in Russia think the United States would like to do regime change in Russia. And if you go to Beijing, there's a similar way of thinking about American policy. Americans like regime change because you understand, we think we are the indispensable nation. We stand taller. We see further. We know what's best for everybody. And of course, we know what kind of regime every country should have. Right? So I think one could argue that regime change is deeply wired into the American psyche at this point in time, number one. And number two, when you take into account that Hillary Clinton is the one who's going to replace Barack Obama, I think there's little likelihood that we'll get out of the business of regime change anytime soon. And again, you understand what my point is. Regime change leads to unending trouble. And this raises the fascinating question, why do we continue to pursue regime change when it has such terrible results? There's a woman in the back?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, okay.
Yes, my name is Kevin Perganin. I'm from first course of political
You have to
faculty.
talk clearly.
Of first course of political faculty, and I have a question. You were talking about the gap between Americans and Russians, that Americans are incapable of dealing with Russians, and do you think if it is only American-sided problem, or do Russians also have their issues towards working with Americans?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the Russian leadership has reached the point where it finds itself very difficult to deal with the Americans and has become very distrustful of the Americans, right? So in a way, it's become sort of a two-sided game at this point. But I believe that the Americans are principally responsible for causing this situation, right? I believe it is largely an outgrowth of the Ukraine crisis. I believe the Ukraine crisis poisoned relations between the Russians and the Americans. I believe that for a long time the Russians have understood that it was in their interest to work with the United States, and I believe that the Russians wanted to work with the United States, certainly up until the February 22, 2014 coup in Kiev. But I think given that event and given the subsequent relations between the United States and the Russians have now reached the point where they're almost as distrustful of the Americans as the Americans are distrustful of the Russians. And this is a situation that just continues to escalate. And again, it's very depressing because there's no need to have a crisis over Ukraine. And with regard to Syria, it would make eminently good sense if the Russians and the Americans could work together. Yeah. How about this woman right here? Yeah. And then there's a woman back there. You should take the microphone to her in the back. She can go next, because...
Thank you very much for coming here today. You said that Greater Israel is pretty much dead, so it's at this point.
No, I said I said a two-state solution is dead.
Yeah.
And you have a Greater Israel.
Yes. And Bibi Netanyahu said that there would be no Palestinian state on his watch. So my question is, what is your take on the so-called decision at 50?
What is the what?
The so-called decision at 50. This is an initiative put forward by the Israeli people to hold a referendum in 2017 with the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War approaching. And the Israeli people will have or won't have a vote on whether they think it is the time to end the occupation. So,
well,
is it possible to hold such a referendum at this juncture?
Right, but the assumption in your question is that if the Israeli people get to vote, then the occupation will end and there will be a Palestinian state. And I don't believe that there is any meaningful disjuncture between the Israeli people and the Israeli leadership. The Israeli leadership was elected by the Israeli people. the Israeli population, the Israeli body politic is very hawkish, and it has been moving steadily to the right over time and will continue to move further and further to the right over time. And I don't think there's any chance that the Israeli public is going to rise up and tell the leadership they have to end the occupation and we need a Palestinian state. It's just, in my opinion, not going to happen. I hope I'm wrong. And I think what you have now is basically a greater Israel, and you're going to have a greater Israel for the foreseeable future. And that greater Israel, as Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak and others have said, will be an apartheid state, because the Israeli Jews will treat the Israeli Palestinians who live inside that state as second, if not third-class citizens.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Dear Professor Mearsheimer, thank you for your lecture. My name is Christine, and I would like to thank you for your bright and honest speech. And as you can see, we are very impressed, and that's despite the fact that almost all lectures of our professors, MGIMO University professors, are very incredibly bright and honest. Still, and yes. And my question is, maybe it's a bit out of the area of your specialization, but still, I would like to address you this question as to a person of a wide outlook. And here's my question, finally. American political scientist Adam Przeworski claims that economic growth and high level of GDP inevitably leads to democracy. Do you agree with this statement? And if you do, how would you explain the phenomenon that there are some countries, Arab countries, particularly in Persian Gulf, like Saudi Arabia.
You should make your question shorter, because all sorts of people want to ask questions.
Yes. I'm sorry, and like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, they're incredibly rich and GDP is incredibly high there, but still they are not even close to building democratic society and democracy. How can you explain this? And thank you.
Well, this is a subject that I don't have strong feelings on because I haven't studied it. But I would say that it is long been the conventional wisdom among most political scientists that as a country grows more and more prosperous, it eventually becomes a democracy. The argument associated with Adam Przeworski, who was actually my colleague at the University of Chicago for many years. And people point to the Asian tigers as an example of this phenomenon, not to mention other countries as well. The place where you see this argument put forward these days most often is with regard to China, because many people argue that as China modernizes, as its economy grows by leaps and bounds, it eventually will become a democracy. There are growing numbers of people who believe that's not true, and they point to countries in the Middle East and other countries around the world that seem to contradict that. I don't know exactly what to make of this argument, so I'll just leave it at that because it's a subject that I don't know that much about.
Good day once again. I've been waiting a little bit to ask my question, so I'm very happy to finally get to this. Actually, I have two questions, but it's the first one that's the major one. So the first question that I have is probably the most difficult. It's about the nuclear option. It's bringing this debate, bringing this discussion back into your area of expertise, so to speak. So talking about your theory about the regional hegemons and preventing other regional hegemons from appearing. So looking at the current situation, so suppose we have a regional hegemon in a relative decline, so to speak, and a competitor on the rise. And the competitor does not possess a particularly sophisticated or ample arsenal of nuclear weapons, while the reigning hegemon does possess a very ample and sophisticated arsenal of nuclear weapons. Could it be considered rational within the offensive realism theory to simply take the gambit and take the short way out and vaporize the competition, then weather the fallout and remain top dog? Or what do you believe is right within your theory?
Now, just to be clear here, you're arguing that the reigning hegemon has a large nuclear arsenal, and the emerging great power, the rising great power, has a very small nuclear arsenal. And you're saying, is it rational for the dominant power to use nuclear weapons against the minor power or the rising power?
Yes, as a first strike to...
But I just want to be clear here. Use nuclear weapons in what way? To attack the entire country or just take out its nuclear weapons?
Actually, in whichever way, to eliminate the competition, preferably.
No, it's not rational. I mean, first of all, the idea that you were going to vaporize an entire country is not a rational strategy, in my opinion. I think you might want to make the argument that you can use those nuclear weapons to attack the other side's nuclear weapons. You all understand that in the early stages of the Cold War, when the United States had a nuclear monopoly and the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon and then began to develop nuclear weapons, that the United States gave great thought to attacking the Soviets' nuclear arsenal. In other words, strangling it in the cradle. We did not do that. And the United States and the Soviet Union did not do that when China began to develop its nuclear arsenal, because in both cases it became clear that if you attacked the other side's nuclear arsenal, the other side would then build that nuclear arsenal underground in a mountain or hide it, but it would be impossible over the long term to prevent that rising power from ultimately developing nuclear weapons. In other words, there was no way the United States could prevent the Soviet Union from getting nuclear weapons forever. We could only prevent it for a short period of time, and that made no strategic sense.
So in the end, there is a sort of barrier of morality after all, right?
There's a what?
A barrier of morality, so to speak.
No, I didn't use the word morality. I just said I don't...
You didn't, but kind of...
Okay.
If you could, one last question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mearsheimer, for giving us the opportunity to have to listen to your lectures here. So my question is, on Monday you told us about the rise in China, the role of China in contemporary world, and right now the current situation in the Middle East. And you told us that China has a great interest in the Middle East as well, and they are rising right now. And you told that there are a lot of failures in the policy of United States on these targets. So my question is, maybe it's not the worst idea to give the opportunity to China to grow and to resolve these problems in the Middle East if United States cannot do that. Thank you.
Well, the problem with that argument is that if China continues to grow and China gets deeply involved in the Middle East, the United States will definitely not only remain in the Middle East, but become even more involved. And the United States and China will compete in the Middle East. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not that will make the region more or less stable. And I would make the argument that, if anything, that will contribute more to instability in the region. And for that reason, I'd prefer to see the Chinese not get involved in a serious way. I'd prefer to see the Chinese not grow and then develop the power projection capability to interfere in the Middle East. But of course, if China doesn't grow, the United States will still be involved. That was my answer to the question over here. And it will still be causing lots of trouble. So I think either way, the United States is going to end up deeply involved in the Middle East, and either way, it's going to end up either with or without the Chinese causing lots of trouble. You know, before I told you that when I put up my chart here, I said that Africa was an area of the world that was not of great strategic importance to the United States. Sometimes when I give this talk, someone from Africa will come up to me afterwards, and that person is usually quite chagrined, quite disturbed by the fact that I said that Africa is not of great strategic importance to the United States. And I always say to that person, you should be glad that the United States should be glad that the United States is not interested in Africa in any meaningful way. Because if it was, it would be trying to effect regime change, and it would be crashing around like a rogue elephant in Africa, much the way it's crashing around like a rogue elephant in the Middle East, right? Just another quick story on this. I was at a conference on the Arctic last fall in Denmark, and what became very clear at this conference is that the Arctic is a quite peaceful area at this point in time. The Russians, of course, are involved in a big way in the Arctic, and it's a quite peaceful area. And a number of people noted in the course of the conference that the United States was not very interested in the Arctic these days, because the United States is interested in Europe, the Persian Gulf, and East Asia. So we're not paying much attention to the Arctic. So I raised my hand and I said at one point, did anybody ever think that one of the principal reasons that the situation in the Arctic is so peaceful these days is because the United States is occupied elsewhere and not up in the Arctic throwing its weight around? So this is my view with regard to the Middle East. If the United States could accept the fact that there is no country in the Middle East that is now in a position to dominate the region. This is my point about Iran. Iran is the only country that is a potential hegemon in the region, right? There's no country in the region that's a potential hegemon, and therefore there's no reason for us to be onshore. We can adopt an offshore balancing strategy in the Middle East and get out of the business of regime change. And that will go a long way over the long term towards eliminating the instability in the region. There's still going to be instability because local conditions do matter, right? But nevertheless, the Americans are a major contributor to the problem. And therefore, the key is to get the Americans out. But it's almost impossible to get the Americans out because, as I said before, the Americans seem to be hardwired to do regime change, and especially in that region of the world. And this is why I concluded my talk back then, and we'll do it again here, by saying that I'm very pessimistic. I say this with great sadness, but I'm very pessimistic about the future for peace and prosperity in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mearsheimer. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. Thank you. And I remind you that tomorrow will be the last third lecture by Professor Mearsheimer at 5:35 in the conference hall.